One flash, one roar, and an entire city is vaporized beneath a rising mushroom cloud. That's what would happen if a 50-megaton nuclear bomb were dropped on an American city. The devastation would be immediate and absolute. Unfortunately, this isn't entirely a work of fiction. While such a device has never been unleashed on a US city, the bomb itself is a historical fact, the largest nuclear device ever built. The Tsar Bomba was very real, and its destructive power remains unmatched to this day. If the Tsar Bomba was ever launched, in the seconds following detonation, the heart of the city would vanish. Skyscrapers would be blasted to rubble, their steel frames torn apart by the force of the shockwave. Streets would melt under the heat, and cars would be incinerated. The people closest to the epicenter would be vaporized instantly, with no trace left behind, and they would be the lucky ones. Those further out would be hurled through the air, burned, blinded, or buried beneath collapsing buildings. Fires would erupt across the ruins, merging into a single raging firestorm. And above it all, a mushroom cloud would rise into the sky, casting radioactive fallout over everything for hundreds of miles. Such destruction was not an accident of history, it was the result of a deliberate race to build the ultimate weapon. The Tsar Bomba was a weapon born from fear, rivalry, and the pursuit of total supremacy. By the late 1950s, the Cold War had driven the United States and the Soviet Union into a brutal arms race. Both sides were determined to create not just larger arsenals, but weapons of unimaginable power. Tensions were rising, and the first secretary of the Communist Party, Nikita Khrushchev, sought a single, overwhelming demonstration of Soviet might, one that would leave no doubt about who held the upper hand. In 1961, he demanded the development of a nuclear device so powerful it could obliterate entire nations with a single strike. The project fell to a team of scientists at the All-Russian Scientific Research Institute of Experimental Physics, led by physicist Yuri Khariton, working alongside Andrei Sakharov, Viktor Adamski, and Yuri Babayev, among others. Under intense political pressure and tight deadlines, they set out to create the most powerful bomb in human history. The original design called for a 100-megaton thermonuclear device capable of destruction on a scale the world had never seen. However, fears about uncontrollable fallout, potential global consequences, and the survival of the delivery crew forced a compromise. The final weapon, while reduced to around 50 megatons, remained the largest and most devastating nuclear bomb ever built. It was a weapon of war. It was a weapon never intended for battlefield use, but for sheer terrifying impact on the global stage. The Tsar Bomba. The Tsar Bomba test was set for the 30th of October 1961 over the remote Novaya Zemlya archipelago in the Arctic Ocean. The sheer size of the bomb created immediate logistical problems. Weighing 27 tons and measuring over 26 feet long, it could not fit inside a standard bomber. Engineers stripped the Tu-95V bomber of its bomb bay doors, and special modifications were made to the fuselage just to carry the weapon. Major Andrei Dernovtsev, the pilot, knew that he and his crew had only about a 50% chance of surviving the mission. To improve their odds, engineers fitted the bomb with a massive parachute to slow its descent, giving the plane a few extra minutes to clear the blast radius. Even so, the shockwave caught up with them, violently rocking the aircraft and nearly tearing it from the sky. The Tsar Bomba detonated at an altitude of around 13,000 feet. The fireball was so massive it nearly touched the ground despite the high-altitude blast. It expanded to nearly 6 miles across, consuming everything below in a wave of light and heat. The mushroom cloud soared over 40 miles into the atmosphere, reaching into the mesosphere. It was so big it could be seen from over 600 miles away. The shockwave circled the Earth 3 times. Wooden houses hundreds of miles from ground zero were obliterated. Structures as far as 34 miles away were destroyed. For those close enough to see it, the landscape was briefly lit up brighter than the sun, and the blast wave knocked people off their feet hundreds of miles away. The explosion was so powerful that it registered seismic readings comparable to a magnitude 5.0 earthquake. Radio communications were disrupted for hours, and atmospheric pressure changes were detected across the globe. Windows shattered over 560 miles from the detonation site. The Soviet Union immediately released carefully staged footage of the test, making it clear to the world, and particularly the United States, that the USSR could inflict unimaginable destruction. The world's reaction to the Tsar Bomba test was immediate. Although the Soviet Union framed the detonation as a demonstration of strength, international observers viewed it as an act of terrifying recklessness. Western governments, particularly in the US and Europe, condemned the test as a dangerous escalation of the arms race. Scientists and military leaders alike were alarmed by the sheer scale of the explosion, which had shattered all previous assumptions about the limits of nuclear power. Even within the Soviet Union, some figures, including Soviet physicist Andrei Sakharov, had begun to voice concern that such weapons threatened not only enemies, but the survival of humanity itself. The Tsar Bomba sent a worrying message that nuclear technology had reached a point where it could no longer be controlled. The possibility of global annihilation was no longer theoretical, it was a reality. The Tsar Bomba's scale becomes even more staggering when compared to other nuclear weapons in history. The bomb dropped on Hiroshima on August 6, 1945, nicknamed Little Boy, had a yield of approximately 15 kilotons. It destroyed nearly 5 square miles of the city and killed an estimated 70,000 people instantly. Tens of thousands more died from injuries and radiation exposure in the following months. It was the first time a nuclear weapon had ever been used in warfare, and it introduced the world to the horrors on an unimaginable scale. Just 3 days later, on August 9, 1945, the United States dropped a second bomb on Nagasaki, known as Fat Man. Slightly more powerful at around 21 kilotons, Fat Man detonated over a valley, which slightly limited its destructive reach compared to Hiroshima. Nevertheless, it killed an estimated 40,000 people instantly, with final death tolls rising above 80,000 as radiation effects took hold. Together, Hiroshima and Nagasaki demonstrated that even relatively small nuclear weapons could annihilate entire cities and inflict suffering for generations. Less than a decade later, on March 1, 1954, the United States tested its most powerful nuclear device at Bikini Atoll in the Marshall Islands. Castle Bravo was intended to yield around 6 megatons, but due to a miscalculation in its design, the actual explosion reached 15 megatons, more than double what was expected. The blast vaporized several islands, created serious radioactive fallout, and contaminated nearby islanders and U.S. personnel. Castle Bravo was at the time the largest nuclear explosion ever carried out by the United States and led to a global reckoning about the dangers of nuclear fallout. And then came the Tsar Bomba. Detonated in 1961, it dwarfed them all. At 50 megatons, over 3,000 times the power of Little Boy, the Tsar Bomba wasn't just larger, it operated on an entirely different scale. If the Tsar Bomba detonated over a major American city, the first few seconds would be a level of destruction unmatched in human history. The fireball would reach nearly 6 miles across, vaporizing everything within it. Buildings, vehicles, and people would be reduced to ash in an instant. Temperatures at the center would soar to tens of millions of degrees, hotter than the surface of the sun. A blinding flash would ignite fires over areas hundreds of square miles wide. The blast wave would race outward at over 1,500 miles per hour, flattening skyscrapers, bridges, homes, and factories in a radius of at least 20 to 30 miles. Winds stronger than any hurricane would tear apart steel and concrete structures as easily as paper. Anyone not instantly killed by the fireball or the shockwave would suffer fatal burns, crushing injuries, or being hurled thousands of feet through the air. For those caught in the open, survival would be virtually impossible. In less than 10 seconds, a major metro area would cease to exist. In the aftermath of the blast, the scale of human suffering would be overwhelming. Tens of thousands of survivors on the fringes of the explosion would be left with horrific injuries, third-degree burns covering much of their bodies, severe lacerations from flying debris, crushed limbs from collapsed structures, and shattered bones from the force of the blast wave. Many would be blinded by the intense flash of thermal radiation. Radiation sickness would begin within hours, bringing uncontrollable vomiting, internal bleeding, skin sloughing, and rapid organ failure. Yet, no help would come. Hospitals, clinics, and emergency responders within the affected zone would be destroyed or incapacitated. Medical staff who survived would be overwhelmed by the sheer number of casualties. With no supplies, no electricity, and no clean water, makeshift aid stations would quickly run out of antibiotics, blood, and basic equipment. Infected wounds, untreated burns, dehydration, and radiation exposure would turn survivable injuries into death sentences. Within days, disease outbreaks would sweep through the survivor camps, compounding the death toll. For the wounded, the post-blast world would offer no hope, only agony and abandonment. As the fire still raged and the injured struggled to survive, another invisible killer would spread: radioactive fallout. The Tsar Bomba's explosion would inject vast amounts of radioactive debris high into the atmosphere, carried by prevailing winds across hundreds of miles. Within hours, deadly particles would rain down over neighboring cities, farmland, and water supplies. Entire regions would become radioactive death zones, where a single hour of exposure could deliver a lethal dose. Crops and livestock in vast swaths of the country would be poisoned. Rivers would carry radiation into drinking supplies, contaminated reservoirs, and groundwater for generations. The soil itself would remain hazardous, making agricultural recovery impossible for decades. Urban areas spared from the initial blast would face slow, lingering death as the fallout accumulated. Cancer rates, birth defects, and genetic mutations would skyrocket among survivors and their descendants. No simple cleanup could repair the damage. Vast areas of the United States would effectively become permanent exclusion zones, abandoned to radiation and decay. The economic consequences of a Tsar Bomba detonation over a major American city would be immediate and irreversible. If the target were a financial hub like New York City, the destruction of Wall Street, major banks, corporate headquarters, and key government institutions would trigger a financial meltdown unlike anything in history. The stock market would collapse within minutes. Insurance markets would vaporize. The banking system would freeze as records, servers, and personnel were wiped out. Across the country, supply chains for food, fuel, medicine, and basic goods would collapse as trucking, rail, and shipping networks broke down. Energy grids would fail, cutting power to vast regions even outside the blast zone. Panic would spread to international markets, causing a global depression overnight. Foreign investment in the United States would vanish. Governments around the world would scramble to stabilize their economies, but few would succeed. In the United States, unemployment would soar to catastrophic levels, currency values would plummet, and inflation would spiral out of control. No nation truly untouched by the fallout. In the aftermath of the attack, the United States would face the largest mass migration crisis in history. Tens of millions of people would be forced to flee radioactive zones, abandon cities, and fire-ravaged suburbs in a desperate search for safety. Entire states would see their populations uprooted almost overnight, overwhelming neighboring regions that would be unprepared to absorb the human flood. Refugee camps, if they could be established at all, would struggle to provide even the most basic necessities, such as food, clean water, shelter, and security. Panic would spread as law enforcement stretched beyond its limits, failed to maintain order. Martial law would likely be declared in dozens of states as authorities tried to control the chaos. Looting, violence, and armed clashes over dwindling resources would become common. Cities untouched by the blast would rapidly descend into unrest as millions of desperate, hungry, and sick refugees flood in. Both internal and international borders would harden or collapse under the pressure. The social fabric of the United States would begin to tear apart, not just from the physical destruction, but from the sheer weight of human desperation. Beyond the immediate devastation, the detonation of a device as massive as the Tsar Bomba could trigger catastrophic environmental effects on a global scale. The explosion would inject millions of tons of soot, ash, and radioactive debris high into the atmosphere, where it would block sunlight for months or even years. Temperatures would plummet worldwide, leading to shorter growing seasons, failed harvests, and mass starvation, a phenomenon known as a nuclear winter. Crops would wither under cold, darkened skies. Livestock would die from radiation exposure and a lack of feed. Food shortages would escalate into full-blown famines across continents. Even in regions untouched by the initial blast, developing nations already vulnerable would face widespread collapse first. But no country would be truly immune. Global trade networks would disintegrate as countries hoarded dwindling supplies. Mass starvation, resource wars, and political upheaval would follow, plunging much of the planet into a second wave of disaster. A single Tsar Bomba detonation over one city could ultimately tip the entire world into environmental and social catastrophe. Even for those who survived the blast, the fallout, and the collapse of infrastructure, life would never return to normal. The psychological trauma inflicted by the Tsar Bomba detonation would scar an entire generation. Survivors would suffer from severe post-traumatic stress disorder, anxiety, and depression on a massive scale. Families would be torn apart, communities shattered, and faith in institutions destroyed. In the absence of a functioning government and stable social systems, trust between individuals would erode rapidly. Across the country and eventually across the world, the psychological wounds inflicted by a single detonation would fester for decades, leaving a world permanently altered, not just physically, but mentally and morally. This scenario is almost beyond comprehension. A single bomb triggering mass death, societal collapse, global famine, and the end of civilization as we know it. Yet the most chilling truth is, the power to unleash that destruction has never gone away. While it's unlikely that a weapon like the Tsar Bomba would ever be deployed today, the underlying threat has not disappeared. During the Cold War, superweapons like the Tsar Bomba were seen primarily as political tools. They were demonstrations of technological and military dominance rather than practical weapons for use on the battlefield. After the Tsar Bomba's test in 1961, both the United States and the Soviet Union shifted their focus away from ever-increasing yields. Instead, their strategies evolved toward survivable, deliverable nuclear forces. They wanted weapons that could be launched at a moment's notice, survive a first strike, and accurately destroy critical military, industrial, and governmental targets. Today's strategic arsenals prioritize multiple independently targeted re-entry vehicles, missiles carrying several smaller nuclear warheads, each able to strike different targets independently. Modern warheads such as the American W-88, which can yield 475 kilotons, or the Russian Avangard system, yielding between 800 kilotons and 2 megatons, are capable of erasing entire cities. But they're designed for tactical precision rather than sheer overwhelming force. Despite the shift towards smaller, more practical nuclear weapons, the knowledge to build planet-destroying bombs has never been lost. The raw fissile materials, uranium and plutonium, remain stockpiled in military bunkers and civilian facilities around the world. Deploying a weapon on the scale of the Tsar Bomba would present serious logistical challenges. Its enormous size and weight made it impossible to mount on a missile, and it requires a slow, vulnerable bomber to deliver it. Such delivery methods would be easy targets for today's advanced air defenses. Moreover, the political consequences of detonating such a device would be catastrophic beyond imagining. Instant global condemnation, environmental collapse, and almost certain escalation to all-out nuclear war. However, technological advances may be quietly eroding the barriers that once made superweapons impractical. Hypersonic glide vehicles, stealth bombers like the American B-21 Raider, and heavy-lift rockets could theoretically allow states to deliver ultra-large payloads without interception. The next generation of space-based and missile defense systems could paradoxically make ultra-high-yield weapons more attractive to strategic planners. As command systems grow more automated, cyber warfare expands, and political tensions sharpen, the potential for catastrophic miscalculation rises dramatically. The greatest danger today is not just the massive arsenals held by the United States and Russia, but the sheer number of nations now capable of unleashing nuclear chaos. China is undergoing a rapid and deliberate nuclear expansion. Beijing is building hundreds of new missile silos, developing advanced intercontinental ballistic missiles, and deploying hypersonic glide vehicles designed to evade even the most sophisticated Western missile defense systems. France and the United Kingdom each maintain independent nuclear forces, with second strike capabilities housed in ballistic missile submarines that patrol undetected beneath the oceans. India and Pakistan, two nuclear-armed rivals with a long history of military conflict, both possess short and medium-range nuclear-capable missiles. Any future border clash, like those seen in Kashmir, risks spiraling into a devastating regional nuclear war. North Korea, despite its small arsenal, continues to refine its missile technology, boasting weapons that could strike South Korea, Japan, or even the US mainland. Its threats are not theoretical, they are regular features of state propaganda and military exercises. Israel maintains deliberate ambiguity about its arsenal but is widely believed to possess dozens of nuclear warheads, with potential delivery systems ranging from aircraft to submarines. Each of these states has the capacity to kill millions, destabilize global markets, trigger mass migration, and plunge entire regions into irreversible chaos, even without weapons the scale of the Tsar Bomba. The reality is stark. While no single device today matches the sheer size of the Tsar Bomba, the global nuclear arsenal remains more than sufficient to destroy civilization many times over. In a modern nuclear exchange, weapons would be smaller, faster, and more numerous, but the devastation would be just as total. A single misstep, a single misinterpreted missile launch, a cyber attack disabling warning systems, or a rogue decision by a desperate leader could unleash a chain reaction that ends the world in hours, not days. The Tsar Bomba remains a chilling symbol of what humanity is capable of creating, but the weapons of today may prove even more dangerous. They make nuclear war easier to start, harder to control, and almost impossible to survive. The Tsar Bomba was never truly meant to be used. It was built as a threat, a statement, a symbol of absolute power. But what it revealed was terrifying. A single weapon could erase everything a city had ever built, its people, its culture, its future, in less than 10 seconds. Unfortunately, the systems that built the Tsar Bomba still exist. The arsenals are still armed, and the human capacity for miscalculation, aggression, or desperation remains unchanged. The shadow of the Tsar Bomba still hangs over us, not just as a relic of the Cold War, but as a living warning. In a time of rising global tensions, the possibility of a weapon like this being used is not science fiction. It could take out an entire US city instantly, and the fallout would ripple across the planet. In the nuclear age, survival doesn't depend on force, it depends on discipline, dialogue, and the hope that restraint will hold. Now go check out What If USA Launched a Nuclear Bomb Minute by Minute, or click on this video instead.